The night is quiet now, and as you settle in, let me take you back to the beginning of my story. I want you to imagine the sound of waves brushing against the shore, the gentle rhythm of the Pacific rolling in and out. That was the music of my childhood, a reminder that the world was vast, and that I was only beginning to understand my place within it. I was born on an island in the middle of the ocean, in Honolulu, Hawaii, where the sun rises out of the sea and sets into it again. To many, Hawaii is paradise, beaches and breezes, palm trees swaying. For me, it was also a place of questions. My mother, Anne, was a young woman from Kansas, raised on values of hard work and a restless desire to explore. My father, Barack Obama Sr., came from Kenya, a student who had crossed oceans to study in America. Their union was brief, a spark that burned out quickly, but it left me with a legacy I would wrestle with all my life. I grew up mostly without him, his presence more myth than memory, a figure told in stories rather than felt in flesh. My mother and grandparents filled the spaces he left behind. My mother believed the world was bigger than any one place, and she wanted me to know that. When I was 6, she took me to Indonesia, where she had remarried. Jakarta was noisy, crowded, alive with contradictions. I remember narrow streets filled with motorbikes, markets spilling with fruits and spices, children kicking makeshift balls through the dust. I learned to adapt, to find friendship in unfamiliar languages, to watch carefully when I couldn't yet understand. Life there wasn't easy. Sometimes it meant no steady electricity. Sometimes it meant seeing poverty up close in a way I hadn't in Hawaii, but it taught me resilience and it taught me empathy. My stepfather, Lolo, was a gentle man who believed in patience. He'd tell me that the world was hard, that you couldn't always bend it to your will, but you had to endure it, to keep going. My mother, on the other hand, filled my head with books and ideals. She'd wake me early before school, sit me down at a small table and hand me lessons as though they were treasures. She wanted me to dream big, to see beyond what was in front of me. Between the two of them, I learned balance, the need to survive the world as it was, but also the hope to imagine what it might become. When I returned to Hawaii as a boy, I lived with my grandparents, Toot and Gramps. Their small apartment was modest, their love steady. My grandmother worked her way up in a bank, disciplined and tough, while my grandfather carried stories of the war, jokes at the ready, and a belief that life was meant to be faced with humor and grit. They gave me stability in a world where I often felt out of place. For the truth was, even in Hawaii with its diversity, I wrestled with questions of identity. I looked in the mirror and saw skin darker than my mother's, hair different than my classmates. I didn't see many faces like mine, and that left me wondering where I belonged. Some days I felt Hawaiian, other days American, other days something undefined, a puzzle of pieces that didn't seem to fit neatly together. The absence of my father only deepened that question. Who was I really? Where did I fit? Those thoughts kept me restless, searching, even as I played basketball on sunlit courts or studied late into the night. I remember vividly one afternoon when a classmate asked me if my father was a prince. The idea had never crossed my mind, but I realized then that to many my heritage was exotic, foreign, something they didn't know how to place. I laughed it off, but inside I wondered. Was there nobility in my blood, or only absence? I would not know for years, but that sense of mystery about my father became a shadow that followed me into adulthood. Still, childhood had its joys. I found refuge on the basketball court, where the rhythm of the game quieted my doubts. I lost myself in books, devouring stories of heroes and histories, always searching for a reflection of myself within their pages. And I found guidance in teachers who saw more in me than I saw in myself, who nudged me forward, who told me that intelligence was not enough unless it was married to discipline. As you listen now, I want you to picture that boy, lanky, uncertain, walking the edge between two worlds. He carried the sound of the Pacific in his ears, the heat of Jakarta in his skin, the lessons of a mother who believed in ideals and a father who had vanished. He laughed with his grandfather, studied with his grandmother, played ball with friends, but inside he was always asking, who am I meant to be? That question was not a burden, though at times it felt heavy. It was a calling, a pull forward. I learned early that identity is not handed to you neatly wrapped. You must shape it, question it, wrestle with it. My story began with absence, but absence left space. Space I would fill with experience, with choices, with purpose yet to be discovered. Looking back now, I see that the boy who once wandered between Honolulu's shores and Jakarta's streets was already being prepared. The uncertainty, the searching, the sense of being an outsider, these would become my tools, my ways of connecting with others who felt unseen. The quiet lessons of resilience and imagination, whispered in kitchens and classrooms, would one day carry me further than I could have dreamed. And so the story began, not in power or prominence, but in questions and contradictions. A child of two worlds, belonging fully to neither, learning slowly that sometimes it is in the spaces between that the most powerful stories are born. I carried the shadow of my father with me, even when I didn't fully understand the weight it held. My mother told me stories about him, his intelligence, his charm, his determination to leave a small village in Kenya and chase knowledge across the ocean. But these were fragments, glimpses, not memories of my own. He was there and not there, a ghost who shaped me more by absence than by presence. I knew him through old photographs, sepia-toned images where he stood tall and proud in suits that seemed too formal for the dusty roads he'd walked as a boy. I wondered often what it would have been like to sit across from him, to hear his voice not through others but directly, to know the man behind the myth. In Hawaii, my grandparents tried to fill the gap. Gramps would tell me to stand tall, to shake hands firmly, to look people in the eye. Toot would press me to excel, to take responsibility seriously. They gave me the structure my father couldn't, but still, I felt the gap. At times, I looked at other boys with their fathers in the stands at basketball games or teaching them to shave, and I felt the ache of missing something essential. That absence gnawed at me, shaping questions about manhood, about heritage, about who I was meant to become. My teenage years were a mix of searching and pretending. I spent hours on the basketball court because in those games I could lose myself, let my body and the ball tell a story that words couldn't. I read voraciously books about Malcolm X, James Baldwin, Ralph Ellison, voices that spoke to the complexity of race, identity, the tension of being black in America. Their words felt like letters addressed to me personally, proof that I was not alone in the confusion, that my questions had been asked before. And yet I wasn't always steady. Like so many teenagers, I drifted through phases of rebellion and doubt. I experimented, made mistakes, tried to mask my uncertainty with bravado. But beneath it all was a gnawing desire to understand myself. I looked at my mother, who sacrificed so much to raise me with compassion and curiosity, and I wanted to honor her belief in me. I thought of my father, far away in Africa, and I wanted to prove that I could be more than just his absence. At times, my identity felt like two opposing forces pulling me in different directions. On one side, the Midwestern roots of my mother and grandparents, hard work, modesty, a belief in fairness. On the other, the distant but powerful call of Africa, a lineage of struggle and pride, a reminder of histories I had not lived but carried in my skin. I didn't yet know how to bridge these worlds, but I knew that somewhere in the middle lay the truth of me. When I was 10, my father visited Hawaii for a short time. He came bearing gifts and a quiet dignity. He wasn't there long, but those days left a mark. I remember sitting beside him, listening as he spoke with a confidence that seemed unshakable. He told me about Kenya, about family I had never met, about a world that was both mine and foreign. It was only a few weeks, a brief chapter, but it was enough to plant seeds, a yearning to know more, a hunger for connection, a sense that my story was bigger than the streets I walked daily. Still, when he left again, the silence returned, and with it came the realization that if I wanted to understand my path, I would have to chart it myself. No father to guide me, no single place to claim as fully my own. Only the restless drive inside me, urging me forward. By the time I finished high school, the question of belonging still lingered. Hawaii was beautiful, but I felt constrained, as though I needed to test myself beyond the island's shores. I knew that to discover who I was meant to be, I had to leave, to seek, to fail, to rise. That decision was not about rejecting where I came from, but about pursuing the pieces of myself I had yet to find. As I packed my bags, preparing to head to the mainland, I carried with me fragments of lessons. My mother's belief in ideals, my grandparents' insistence on perseverance, my father's shadow, both inspiring and haunting. They did not add up to a full picture yet, but I trusted that in time the pieces would fit. What I did not yet realize was that the questions of my youth, questions of identity, belonging, purpose, would not disappear. They would follow me into New York, into Chicago, into politics, into the presidency itself. And in each new chapter, I would discover that my greatest strength lay not in having all the answers, but in daring to keep asking. New York was cold, harsher than the warmth of Hawaii or the humidity of Jakarta. When I first arrived at Columbia, the city felt like an immovable giant. Its streets thrumming with energy, its people always in motion, indifferent to the young man who drifted among them with books under his arm and questions in his heart. I lived in small apartments, shared spaces where the paint peeled and the heat clanked through old radiators. Meals were simple, money scarce, but the solitude was something I both feared and craved. In those years, I often walked the streets alone, a stranger in a city that swallowed millions. I'd wander through Harlem, listening to the voices rising from stoops and storefront churches. I studied in libraries, searching not just for facts but for direction, underlining passages that seemed to whisper guidance. New York had a way of confronting you, forcing you to reckon with who you were and what you stood for. And I was still searching, still restless, trying to make sense of my purpose. After graduation, I could have chosen a more comfortable path, a job in a corporate office or a law firm, but something in me resisted. I wanted my life to matter beyond paychecks and prestige. So I went west to Chicago, a city still marked by steel and struggle, a city where neighborhoods bore the scars of factories shutting down and schools crumbling. I went there not with a master plan, but with a willingness to learn, to work as a community organizer, to listen to voices too often ignored. In church basements and community halls, I sat with families who felt abandoned, workers laid off, parents worried about crime, children caught in schools that had long been underfunded. Their anger was raw, but beneath it lay hope, the belief that with effort and unity, change was still possible. My job wasn't glamorous. I earned little, sometimes questioned whether I was making any difference at all. But I saw the quiet power of people gathering, the way dignity returned when neighbors realized they weren't alone. I remember the night we held a meeting about asbestos in public housing. The room was packed with mothers holding children on their laps, fathers shifting nervously in the back, waiting for someone to tell them their concerns mattered. When I stood and spoke, I didn't pretend to have all the answers. I simply acknowledged their fears, their frustrations, and urged them to act together. The look on their faces when they realized their voices carried weight, that memory has stayed with me. It taught me that leadership is less about grand speeches and more about giving people the tools to raise their own. Those Chicago years hardened me. I encountered corruption, cynicism, systems that resisted change. There were nights when I sat alone in my apartment, wondering if I was wasting my time, if idealism was too fragile for the grit of reality. Yet, each time I doubted, I returned to the neighborhoods, to the people whose lives bore the brunt of inequality. Their faith, fragile but unbroken, gave me reason to continue. It was during this time that I began to understand the depth of faith in the Black church. I'd been searching for belonging all my life, and in those pews I heard voices that sang of suffering but also of redemption. I listened to sermons that spoke of justice, of resilience, of God's hand in the fight for dignity. Those Sundays gave me something I had long been missing, a sense of community that felt like home. I wasn't yet certain where these paths would lead. I didn't imagine the White House. The thought would have seemed absurd, but I knew that the work mattered. It connected me not only to Chicago, but to something larger, a thread running through history, the belief that ordinary people bound together could bend the arc of their lives toward justice. And so, with each meeting, each rally, each conversation in cramped kitchens or church halls, I grew a little more sure of who I was becoming. Not a man defined by absence, but a man defined by presence, by the act of showing up, listening, and standing with others in their fight. That discovery didn't resolve all the questions of my identity, but it began to answer another: what kind of life I wanted to live. Looking back, those years taught me that hope is not some airy notion, but something hammered out in the struggles of daily life. It is found in the determination of a mother demanding clean air for her child, in the faith of a pastor speaking truth to power, in the laughter of children playing outside crumbling buildings, still dreaming despite it all. That was Chicago's gift to me, the reminder that hope, when nurtured, becomes not just an emotion but a force. And though I didn't yet know the road ahead, I carried with me the conviction that change was possible, even if it came slowly, even if it came one voice, one neighborhood, one struggle at a time. Harvard was a different kind of world, one built not on the worn streets of Chicago, but in the quiet halls of history, where wood-paneled rooms and vaulted ceilings carried the weight of centuries. When I arrived, I felt again the familiar sensation of being both inside and outside, a participant yet also an observer, wondering if I belonged. The students around me were brilliant, ambitious, many already destined for power. I was just a young man still finding his footing, carrying with me the stories of church basements and crowded apartments. Law came alive for me there, not as dry text, but as a tool, a way of shaping society, of making ideals concrete. I buried myself in books, in cases, in late-night debates that stretched until dawn. Slowly, professors and peers began to notice me, not just for what I knew, but for how I listened, how I tried to weave conflicting perspectives into something larger. It wasn't about being the loudest in the room. It was about trying to see the whole picture. In time, I was elected president of the Harvard Law Review, the first black student ever to hold that position. The title drew attention I wasn't seeking, headlines that seemed to matter more to others than to me. For me, it was simply a chance to prove that I could work, that I could lead through patience and persistence, that I could bring together voices from across the ideological spectrum. It was a small stage, but it taught me lessons I would carry into every larger one that followed. It was also during these years that I met Michelle. She was sharp, focused, grounded in a way that made me stop and take notice. When I walked into a room, she didn't swoon, didn't treat me as anything extraordinary. Instead, she challenged me, tested me, made me earn every inch of her respect. Michelle had grown up on the south side of Chicago, knew the weight of struggle, and carried herself with a strength that came from family and faith. Where I could be dreamy, she was practical. Where I was restless, she was steady. Our early days together were filled with conversations that stretched long into the night, about race, about justice, about family, about what kind of lives we wanted to build. She laughed easily, but also saw through pretenses quickly. I came to understand that she was not just someone I loved, but someone who made me better, who sharpened my edges and steadied my compass. I can still remember walking through the streets of Chicago with her, hand in hand, imagining futures that felt both daunting and possible. We were young, uncertain of where our paths would lead, but already I felt the weight of her presence as something I could not imagine life without. Years later, I would often say that I got where I did because Michelle believed in me, and it was true. She believed when I doubted, steadied me when I wavered, reminded me that ambition without values was hollow. Harvard gave me credentials, but Michelle gave me purpose. Between the two, I began to glimpse a path forward, not fully clear, not yet defined, but visible enough to follow. When I graduated, I carried with me more than degrees or accolades. I carried the memory of nights spent immersed in books, the lessons of listening deeply, and the partnership of a woman whose love and strength would anchor me through every storm ahead. As I look back, those years were less about achievement and more about alignment, aligning the restless boy from Hawaii and Jakarta with the man who would one day stand on the world stage. For the first time, I felt the pieces of my life beginning to fit together, not perfectly, but enough to give me the confidence that I could shape my own destiny. And though I still did not imagine the presidency, still did not dream of such heights, I began to understand that my story was larger than myself, that perhaps the questions I had wrestled with all my life could be turned outward, toward a larger audience, a larger purpose, that maybe my searching could help others searching too. Chicago drew me back like gravity. It was where Michelle's roots lay, where the work still felt unfinished, where the streets hummed with the same energy that had shaped me years before. After Harvard, I could have gone anywhere, taken a comfortable path in a law firm or sought the safety of academia. Instead, I chose to return to the neighborhoods I had once organized in, to test whether the law I had studied could live in the lives of ordinary people. I taught constitutional law at the University of Chicago, but my classroom was never limited to lecture halls. I spent time in community centers, sat with activists, worked on voter registration drives. The law was important, yes, but I believed that democracy lived not only in courts and legislatures, but in the act of a single citizen deciding her voice mattered enough to cast a ballot. Politics came calling almost naturally. I saw that legislation could change more in a stroke than months of meetings in basements. So I ran for the Illinois State Senate, walking block by block, shaking hands, listening to complaints about schools, jobs, housing, crime. I won, but politics in Springfield was its own world. Smoky backrooms, party bosses, favors traded. I was young, idealistic, and often impatient. Some colleagues thought me aloof, others thought me naive. Yet slowly, I learned how to navigate, how to make deals without losing myself. There were victories, small but real, expanding healthcare for children, pushing for ethics reform, working to bridge divides. But there were frustrations too, moments when entrenched interests pushed back, when progress seemed agonizingly slow. I told myself then that politics was a long game, that change often comes in inches, not miles. Still, the weight of compromise pressed heavily at times, and I wondered if I could last in that world without losing the fire that had first driven me. I tested myself further in 2000, running for Congress against Bobby Rush, a veteran politician and former Black Panther. I thought my message of unity, my vision of a broader politics would carry the day. Instead, I lost badly. It was humbling, even humiliating. I questioned everything, my abilities, my voice, my future. There were nights when I lay awake next to Michelle, staring at the ceiling, wondering if I had mistaken ambition for calling. Michelle was patient, but firm. She reminded me that public life was not about me, but about the people I claimed to serve. She told me to either recommit or step away, to be honest with myself about what I was willing to endure. Her clarity steadied me, even when my pride smarted. Failure, I realized, was not the end. It was a teacher. So I returned to the basics. I focused again on my work in the state Senate, dug deeper into legislation that mattered to families on the South Side. I listened more, spoke less, learned how to turn ideals into policy without surrendering principle. The sting of defeat lingered, but it sharpened me. It forced me to understand that politics was not about quick ascents, but about endurance. At home, Michelle and I were raising our daughters, Malia and Sasha. Their laughter filled our house, their small hands clutched mine with a trust that reminded me daily of why I worked as hard as I did. Parenthood brought perspective. The frustrations of politics felt smaller when compared to the joy of bedtime stories or the sight of my daughters asleep, peaceful in their rooms. It reminded me that leadership begins at home, in the example you set for the people who know you best. By the early 2000s, I felt a new sense of clarity. I had been humbled, shaped, tested. I had seen the machinery of politics up close and still believed it could be bent toward justice. The boy who once questioned where he belonged had grown into a man certain of his purpose, to use whatever voice I had to widen the circle of opportunity, to tell a story big enough to include everyone. What I did not yet know was that another stage was waiting, larger than I could have imagined. A single speech, just a few minutes long, would carry my voice far beyond Illinois, far beyond anything I had dreamed. And when that moment came, I would be ready. The summer of 2004 was heavy with heat, the air thick in Boston as delegates poured into the Democratic National Convention. I had been invited to give the keynote address, a chance that seemed almost surreal. Just 4 years earlier, I had been licking my wounds from a congressional defeat. Now, suddenly, I was asked to stand before a national audience and speak on behalf of a party still searching for direction. I remember walking backstage, the bright light spilling through the curtains, the hum of thousands of conversations filling the arena. Michelle was there, calm as ever, her hand warm in mine, steadying me. I had written my speech carefully, every line crafted not just to inspire but to connect. I didn't want to speak only to the delegates in the room. I wanted to speak to the factory worker in Ohio, the farmer in Iowa, the single mother in Chicago. I wanted to remind them that politics wasn't just about leaders on stage, but about the people who filled the seats at home. When I stepped out, the roar of the crowd surged like a wave. For a moment, I felt the old nerves, the questions of belonging that had followed me since childhood. But then I began to speak, and the words found their rhythm. I told the story of my father from Kenya and my mother from Kansas, of the unlikely journey that had brought me there. I spoke of the decency and common dreams of ordinary Americans, insisting that there was not a liberal America and a conservative America, but the United States of America. As I spoke, I could feel the crowd lean forward, could feel the air shift. It was not just applause or cheers, but something deeper, a collective recognition that our divisions, though real, did not define us. People who had never heard my name before found themselves nodding, feeling as though I was voicing something they had long believed but hadn't heard spoken aloud in years. By the time I finished, the hall erupted, the sound washing over me in waves. I walked off stage knowing something irreversible had happened. I was no longer just a state senator from Illinois. Overnight, I had become a national figure, someone people whispered about as a future leader. It was dizzying, almost absurd. I still had debts to pay, still lived in a modest house, still carried the weight of ordinary struggles. But the spotlight had found me, and there was no stepping back. The days that followed were a blur of interviews, requests, invitations. People wanted to know who I was, what I planned to do next. Some spoke of the presidency as if it were already written. I brushed it off, told myself it was too soon, that I still had much to prove. But deep down, I felt the stirrings of something larger. The speech had not just revealed me to the nation, it had revealed the nation to me. It showed me that people were hungry for a politics that appealed to hope rather than fear, to unity rather than division. Still, I knew the dangers of sudden fame. For every cheer there would be skeptics, for every headline there would be scrutiny. Michelle reminded me of that often, keeping me grounded, insisting that our family remain intact no matter what path unfolded. Her voice, steady and practical, was my compass, warning me not to mistake applause for purpose. As I returned to Illinois, back to the Senate chamber, back to the daily grind of committee meetings and legislation, I carried a new awareness. I was being watched, measured, judged not only by my votes but by my vision. The weight of expectation settled on my shoulders, but it did not crush me. It steadied me. It reminded me that perhaps my wandering, my searching, had prepared me for this moment. Looking back now, I realized that speech was a hinge in my life, the moment when the boy who once felt like an outsider became a symbol of possibility. It was not destiny, not inevitability. It was the product of years of questions, failures, persistence. But in that moment, on that stage, I began to glimpse the road ahead, a road that would carry me further than I had dared to imagine. And though I did not yet say it aloud, somewhere deep inside, I knew that one day soon I would stand before the American people, not just to speak for a convention, but to ask them to believe in me as their president. The campaign began with whispers, then built into a roar. By early 2007, I stood in Springfield, Illinois, outside the old State House where Abraham Lincoln once spoke, announcing that I would seek the presidency of the United States. The winter air bit at my face, but the crowd's energy warmed me. Some thought it audacious. I was young, relatively new to Washington, still just a junior senator. But I felt that the moment demanded not experience as usual, but a different kind of voice. I knew the odds. Hillary Clinton entered the race as the frontrunner, armed with name recognition, funding, and a vast network. John McCain waited across the aisle, a war hero with decades of service. And yet, when I traveled to towns and cities, when I shook hands in union halls and coffee shops, I felt something stirring. People told me they were tired of cynicism, weary of division, desperate for a politics that lifted rather than dragged down. They didn't just want policies, they wanted hope. We built our campaign differently. We turned to young volunteers, to organizers armed with clipboards and laptops, to supporters willing to give $5 online. It was a grassroots movement powered not by lobbyists, but by ordinary people who believed change was possible. I'd step into high school gyms filled with thousands, the walls vibrating with chants of "Yes, we can." I could see it in their eyes, the belief that this was not just my campaign but theirs. There were challenges at every turn, questions about my experience, doubts about my electability, whispers about whether America was ready to elect a black president. Each time I tried not to deny the doubts but to answer them with vision. I reminded people that hope was not naive, that history bent toward justice only when enough hands reached out to bend it. The primaries against Hillary were grueling, months of debates and contests, victories and losses. There were moments when fatigue settled deep in my bones, when I wondered if we could sustain the energy. But Michelle was there, sharp as ever, reminding me why we had started, reminding me to keep our daughters grounded, reminding me that ambition had to serve something greater than itself. Her honesty cut through the noise, keeping me tethered when the campaign threatened to carry me away. By the time the nomination was secured, the stage was set for a showdown with John McCain. He was a man of courage, someone I respected deeply, but our visions for the country diverged. The economy was teetering, wars dragged on overseas, trust in government was frayed. I told Americans that the election was not about me, but about them, about the kind of country we wanted to be. Election night, November 4th, 2008, I stood in Grant Park, Chicago, looking out at a sea of faces, young and old, black and white, immigrant and native-born. The air was electric, the city skyline glowing against the night. When the networks called the race, when the words "Barack Obama elected president" flashed across the screens, I felt both exhilaration and weight. I thought of my grandmother, who had passed away just days before, and how her journey from a bank desk in Hawaii had carried forward into mine. I thought of my father, a man absent but never gone, whose dreams had crossed oceans to settle in me. I thought of the enslaved and the marchers, the unsung citizens who had paved the way for this moment. Their footsteps echoed in that park, their presence felt in every cheer, every tear. When I took the stage to speak, I told the crowd that change had come to America, but that it was only the beginning. I reminded them that government alone could not solve every problem, that democracy required the participation of its people. I told them the road ahead would be long, the challenges steep, but that together, yes, we could. That night, as Michelle and I tucked our daughters into bed, the reality sank in. The house we would soon live in was not just any house, it was the White House. The girls giggled at the thought of a puppy to come, of rooms to explore. Michelle held my hand, her smile a mixture of pride and resolve. For me, the victory was not only political, it was personal, historical, cultural. It was the culmination of a lifetime of questions about belonging, of doubts about possibility, and it was proof, for anyone who had ever wondered if the arc of the American story could bend toward inclusion, that it could. But as I lay awake that night, long after the cheers had faded, I knew the truth. The real work was only beginning. The campaign had been about hope. The presidency would be about delivering, and history would measure not only the joy of that evening, but what followed in the hard days ahead. The cold air of January 20th, 2009 bit into my skin as I stood on the steps of the Capitol, looking out over the National Mall stretched before me. It was a sea of people, bundled in coats and scarves, their breath rising in clouds, their eyes fixed on the podium. 2 million souls had gathered, filling the streets of Washington with anticipation. The weight of the moment pressed on me, but so did its wonder. I was about to place my hand on the Bible and swear an oath that for generations, men who looked like me had been excluded from. I glanced at Michelle, radiant and steady beside me, and at Malia and Sasha, still too young to fully grasp the magnitude of the day, but sensing, as children do, that history was unfolding around them. Chief Justice Roberts held the Bible. I raised my right hand, repeated the words of the oath, and in that instant, the improbable became real. I was the 44th President of the United States, the first black man to hold the office. The air carried more than winter chill. It carried hope, raw and unfiltered. Across the crowd, people wept openly. Some waved flags, others clasped hands in prayer. I thought of all the stories stitched into that moment. The elderly woman who had once been forced to the back of the bus, now standing in front, tears streaming down her face. The young boy lifted onto his father's shoulders, eyes wide as he watched something once thought impossible become true. That day was not just mine. It belonged to them. It belonged to every person who had fought, marched, sacrificed for the chance to see America bend toward its promise. The days that followed tested that promise quickly. The nation was in crisis. The financial system trembled on the brink of collapse. Unemployment was rising fast. Banks were failing, homes were being foreclosed by the thousands. My first task was to steady the economy, to pass a stimulus package large enough to jolt it back to life. It was a crash course in urgency, where hesitation meant deeper pain for millions of families. Critics called it reckless spending. Supporters said it was necessary salvation. I knew only that inaction was not an option. Not long after, a call came that I never expected so soon. I had been awarded the Nobel Peace Prize. It was an honor that felt both humbling and uncomfortable. I had been in office less than a year. I had not yet ended wars, not yet reshaped the world. The award was not recognition of achievement, but of possibility. It was a message from the world, a collective yearning for America to lead differently, to heal, to inspire. I accepted it with humility, but also with a sober recognition. It raised expectations even higher, added pressure to an already immense burden. Foreign trips began quickly. Cairo, Berlin, London. Crowds abroad greeted me not as a politician, but as a symbol. They chanted my name, held up signs that read hope. They projected onto me their own dreams of America as a beacon, of a world where dialogue replaced conflict. I felt honored but also wary. I knew that symbolism fades, that sooner or later the world would measure me not by words, but by actions. Inside the White House, life settled into its rhythms. Briefings at dawn, meetings that stretched late into the night, decisions that carried consequences far beyond the walls of the Oval Office. Michelle took on her role with grace, focusing on families, children, health, turning the White House into not just a seat of power, but a home. Our daughters grew, adapting to a life where playdates required Secret Service coordination, where every move was watched. I worried for them, wanted them to hold on to as much normalcy as possible, wanted them to still giggle, still argue over chores, still be kids. Through it all, I felt the duality of the presidency, the exhilaration of possibility and the gravity of responsibility. I could inspire millions with a single speech, but I also had to sign orders that sent young soldiers into danger. I could pass laws that shaped healthcare and education, but I also had to comfort families who had lost everything to hurricanes, floods, or senseless acts of violence. The highs were higher than I had ever known, the lows cut deeper. Still, when I looked out the windows of the Oval Office at night, the city lights shimmering beyond the lawn, I reminded myself of why I had come. It was never about perfection. It was about pushing the nation a little further along its path, expanding the circle of opportunity just a bit wider, leaving behind a story that whispered to the next generation, yes, you can. Those early days were heady, filled with symbolism, expectation, and urgency. But beneath the headlines and ceremonies, I felt a constant truth. The work of change is slow, uneven, sometimes heartbreaking. Yet it is also relentless, driven by the same current that had carried me from Hawaii to Chicago, from church basements to that historic oath on the Capitol steps. And though the burden of the presidency weighed heavily, in quiet moments I would think back to that cold January day, to the sight of faces stretching to the horizon, to the sound of voices rising together, and I knew whatever storms awaited, the journey itself was already proof of what was possible. The presidency was never a straight path of triumphs. It was a series of battles fought in the open and in the quiet recesses of policy rooms. Among the most consuming was healthcare. For decades, presidents before me had tried and failed to reform it. Costs soared, millions went uninsured, families went bankrupt because of a single illness. I knew the risks of taking it on, the political minefield, the certainty of opposition, but I also knew that if we waited for a perfect moment, it would never come. The debates were fierce, the halls of Congress filled with voices shouting past one another. Opponents painted the Affordable Care Act as overreach, as socialism, as a threat to freedom. Allies urged me to push harder, to not compromise away its heart. I watched the fight unfold on television screens in living rooms across America, knowing that beyond the slogans and sound bites were real people, parents praying their child's asthma medicine wouldn't bankrupt them, seniors choosing between prescriptions and groceries, workers tied to jobs they hated simply because of health insurance. The law we passed was imperfect, but it was real. Millions gained coverage. Protections were extended to those with pre-existing conditions. For the first time, America inched closer to the promise that healthcare was a right, not a privilege. The weight of the office was not only domestic. Abroad, threats remained. Al-Qaeda still haunted us, its leader Osama bin Laden a ghost moving through caves and compounds. Years of intelligence gathering, of narrow leads and false trails, finally converged on a walled compound in Abbottabad, Pakistan. The room in the White House where we monitored the operation was silent, but for the ticking of the clock and the murmur of radios. I sat with my team, watching images flicker, aware that lives hung on every second. When word came that the mission had succeeded, that bin Laden was dead, I felt no joy, only a deep exhale. Relief for the victims of September 11th, for the families who had waited a decade for justice. It was a victory, but a solemn one. Not all moments carried triumph. The rise of the Tea Party, fueled by anger at the government, and sharpened by resentment at my very presence in the White House, hardened divisions in ways I had hoped to soften. The economy recovered slowly, too slowly for those still out of work. In foreign policy, Syria became a wound I could not close, its civil war spilling suffering across borders, testing America's role as both leader and restraint. Each day, the decisions weighed heavier, the distance between the poetry of hope and the prose of governing growing wider. Racial tensions flared too, sometimes in ways that struck close to home. The killing of Trayvon Martin, the protests in Ferguson, the chorus of voices shouting that Black lives must matter. These moments reminded me that my election, historic as it was, had not ended America's struggle with race. In fact, it had brought old wounds to the surface. Some saw me as a symbol of progress, Others saw me as a provocation. I tried to speak with care, with honesty, reminding Americans that our union was still unfinished, that the work of justice stretched long beyond one presidency. Yet even amid setbacks, I held on to small victories that mattered deeply. The repeal of Don't Ask, Don't Tell, allowing gay and lesbian Americans to serve openly in the military. The recovery of the auto industry, which had once stood on the brink of collapse. The steps we took to confront climate change, however incomplete. Each achievement felt like a stone placed on a path that others would continue walking. Michelle stood beside me through it all, her grace and resilience shining in moments when I faltered. She took on her own battles, childhood obesity, military families, and in doing so reminded Americans that leadership was not confined to the Oval Office. Our daughters grew taller, wiser, more aware of the world watching them. I worried for their innocence, tried to protect it where I could, but also saw in them a strength that gave me hope. Through triumphs and failures alike, I returned often to the same truth. The presidency is not about perfection. It is about persistence. It is about showing up every day, absorbing the blows, celebrating the small steps forward, and never surrendering to cynicism. By the time my second term drew to a close, I was tired, but not broken, tempered by battles that had tested every part of me. I knew I had not solved every problem, had not fulfilled every promise, but I also knew that the story of America was never about one person, never about one presidency. It was about the collective struggle, the ongoing effort to bend that long arc of history toward justice. And even in the nights when I sat alone in the residence, the lights of Washington twinkling outside, doubts gnawing at me, I held on to the conviction that hope, fragile, stubborn, enduring, was still the most powerful force in our politics. The final year of my presidency was a study in both endings and beginnings. I felt the weight of 8 years pressing down, the decisions made, the battles won and lost, the scars left behind. Yet I also felt a strange lightness, the knowledge that soon the responsibility would pass to another, that I would walk out of the Oval Office as a private citizen once again. I thought often of that January day in 2009, when millions filled the mall and the air was electric with possibility. The years between had dulled some of that shine, worn away by the grind of governing, by partisanship sharper than I had ever anticipated. But they had also revealed something deeper. That progress in America is not about a single moment or leader, but about the slow, steady work of countless hands. In January of 2017, I stood once again before the nation to deliver my farewell address. This time the hall was in Chicago, my adopted home. The city that had given me purpose, had introduced me to Michelle, had grounded my politics in real lives. The faces in the audience reflected the same diversity that had shaped my journey, young and old, black and white, Latino, Asian, native, immigrant, citizen. They looked to me one last time, not for promises, but for reflection. I told them what I believed with all my heart, that democracy is not self-executing, that it requires participation, vigilance, faith, that the future would test us, but that we were capable of meeting it if we remembered that citizenship was the most important office in a democracy. My voice caught at times not from fatigue but from gratitude. I reminded them that change only happens when ordinary people step forward, when they decide that their voices matter. After the speech, as the applause rose and the music swelled, I looked out and thought of my mother, who had instilled in me the belief that ideals are worth fighting for. I thought of my grandparents, who had sacrificed to raise me in a world that wasn't always kind. I thought of my father, whose absence had driven me to search for meaning, and I thought of Michelle and our daughters, who had walked with me through storms and triumphs, whose love had been my true north. Leaving office did not mean leaving the work. Michelle and I created the Obama Foundation, determined to lift up the next generation of leaders, to pass on not just a legacy, but a challenge, to believe that they too could shape the world. I wrote my story in books, but more importantly, I tried to live it in how I mentored, how I spoke, how I listened. Post-presidency life was quieter, yes, but it carried its own responsibility to use the platform I still had not for power, but for encouragement. I knew that history would debate my record endlessly. Some would focus on what I had not achieved, on wars still unresolved, on divisions that had not healed. Others would celebrate the Affordable Care Act, the Paris Climate Agreement, the economic recovery, the dignity restored in diplomacy. But beyond policies, what I hoped endured was something simpler. The reminder that America's story is still being written, that the improbable remains possible. There were moments after leaving the White House when I would sit with Michelle watching the sun set, our daughters now young women, and I felt the quiet satisfaction of a man who had carried both triumph and burden, who had tried however imperfectly to bend the arc of history closer to justice. I knew my presidency was not the end of the story, but only one chapter in a much longer book. Now as I speak to you in this twilight voice, I invite you to remember not the titles or the offices, but the journey. A boy from Hawaii and Jakarta, shaped by absence and questions, who found purpose in the streets of Chicago, who dared to stand before a nation and ask for its trust, who believed that hope was not a slogan, but a force that could change lives. The years have taught me that hope will always be contested, always fragile, always questioned. But they have also shown me that hope endures because it lives not in one person, not in one presidency, but in the countless hearts of those who refuse to give up on the promise of tomorrow. So as the night deepens and you drift into rest, hold on to that truth. The work of freedom is never finished, but neither is the story of America. And if my journey has meant anything at all, let it be this: that no matter how distant the dream, no matter how steep the climb, yes, we can, and yes, we will.